Hi, Bob.
Hi, Brink.
How you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm looking forward to this lively debate about the future of markets.
Excellent. Before we start, why don't you say a little about the Kauffman Foundation, where you work, and your job there, because it's a pretty cool organization and you have a pretty cool gig. So why don't you tell our viewers a little bit about that?
Okay, thanks a lot. Actually, I think some of our viewers may know about Kauffman because we sponsor National Public Radio, but they may not know much more about it than that. Actually, it was a foundation that was started by a man named Ewing Marion Kauffman. He founded a company called Marion Labs, which was later sold to Aventis, which is now, I think, Sanofi Aventis. He took his several $billion out of that sale and established the Kauffman Foundation and gave it two very clear missions. One is to promote the understanding of entrepreneurship and the importance of it to economic growth. And second, to improve the prospects at the K through 12 educational level for kids, especially from disadvantaged areas. And I think, as it turns out, I think we're going to touch on both of these themes during our talk today.
Good. And before you were at Kauffman, you were at Brookings for quite a while. You're still affiliated with Brookings Institution today. You were in government. You were in the Clinton administration in the Justice Department doing antitrust stuff. Was that your only tenure in government service?
No, I actually I spent almost a couple of years at the Justice Department. I was then Associate Director at the Office of Management and Budget, oversaw the budgets of 6 cabinet agencies. And I started my career on the staff of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Jimmy Carter. And I've done a variety of consultancies and so forth for different federal agencies during the course of my career. When I was at Brookings, I was the head of the Economic Studies program. I'm still a senior fellow at Brookings, and also here at Kauffman, I'm vice president for research and policy. And I guess just one commercial plug for Kauffman. Kauffman, as I just said, has as its mission to promote the understanding of entrepreneurship. Well, in the course of that, we fund a lot of economic research, and I think today we are probably among the top 2 or 3 foundations in the United States supporting economic research. Now, our focus is primarily on economic growth.
And you're the guy who gets to decide how those dollars are distributed.
Well, subject to some oversight by other people here at the foundation. But it's a very collegial organization, and we have, fortunately, a terrific endowment and a lot of freedom, and we're doing our best to keeping economists focused like a laser beam on the importance of innovation and growth.
Now, I know when you were at Brookings, you did a fair amount of work on financial services regulation, which brings us to our first topic, which is the financial meltdown, the takeover of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac just a few days ago. Now, looks like government regulators are hand-holding the breakup and sale of Lehman over this weekend, perhaps. A lot's going on. And it's we all, who follow the news know this is important and grim, but it's very technical and hard for people to keep on top of what any of this means and what's going on. You want to give us a little couple of minute primer on Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, what they do, how they got in this mess, and what's going on now?
Okay, so Fannie and Freddie are really odd ducks, and they have been. They are what are called government-sponsored enterprises, which means they're sort of half public and they're half private. They have a public purpose, but they're private entities owned by shareholders who today almost have nothing left in the value of their stock. But for many years they made lots of money, and what they did, and their purpose was to buy mortgages that were originated by banks and savings and loans, put them on their balance sheet, and then I'd say over the last 20 or 30 years they found an even better way to make money, and that was to what's called securitized mortgages. And so what they would do is they would buy packages of these securities, these mortgages rather, that were being originated by banks and S&Ls, and they would put them into these packages of these pools, and then they would put a Fannie Mae stamp on the pool, which would obligate Fannie or Freddie to pay off the principal or interest if there was a default in some portion of the mortgages that were in the pool. And during the course of their existence, they have become humongous.
Right.
They now either hold or securitize half of all mortgages in the United States. I think I saw some data recently where they're either holding or purchasing or securitizing 80% of the mortgages that have been originated, let's say, in the last year or so during the mortgage crisis. And for years they went along, they made lots of money. In fact, they had enormous rates of return. But there were people in the wilderness who were saying that they were making money on the government's dime because implicitly the feeling was, and the market believed this, so that if they ever got into trouble, that the government would come in and bail out the creditors of Fannie Mae, and in particular make sure that those bonds that Fannie Mae were issuing to support all its activity, that these bonds would be paid off. Now, there was never any understanding that the feds would come in and bail out the shareholders. But when it comes to the debt, that roughly $5 trillion out there was an understanding that Fannie and Freddie would be bailed out, and that was reflected in their interest rates. So that they issued debt to finance themselves, but the interest rates on their debt really were not that much higher than treasuries. And the reason for that was this expectation of a bailout.
So the one important reason why they got so humongous wasn't that they were just savvy market operators who were out competing the other folks in the market, but they had an advantage. They had cheaper financing than anyone else, and the root of that access to cheaper financing was the implicit guarantee of their debt by the federal government.
That's all correct. And so now we fast forward to the current situation, where because of the
just one other thing. Just one other thing. I think they also had one other fairly important advantage over banks and other mortgage lenders, which is that they didn't face the same capital requirements that banks did in holding mortgages or buying mortgages or holding these securities.
That's right. Another way of saying is that they were able to leverage themselves to a much greater degree than your typical bank or S&L. And actually, they didn't pay property taxes in the District of Columbia. There were some other exemptions they had from securities rules. They were treated very favorably.
So they're a creature of government policy designed to encourage home ownership.
Right. And by the way, if we roll the clock back 40 years ago, Fannie, which was the first of the Freddie came along later, but Fannie used to be an arm of the federal government. It was created during the Depression. And it was privatized in 1968, or actually privatized is the wrong word, it was quasi-privatized, in 1968 by Lyndon Johnson because he did not want the debt of Fannie on the books of the federal government. And so this was a way, or at the time supposedly a clever way of getting them off budget. And now 40 years ago, or 40 years later, we find that they've come back to haunt us.
So yeah, they privatized the upside, but not the downside.
That's right.
And so not only have they gotten humongous generally, and with the mortgage market in crisis these days, that's a problem, but in particular, in recent years, they took a pretty big share of the subprime market in particular as well, did they not?
Yeah, although I think technically they securitized or they bought what were called Alt-A mortgages. And Alt-A are sort of mortgages that are in between prime quality loans and true subprime loans.
Gotcha.
But forget all the details. The bottom line is that they got in the business of securitizing or buying riskier mortgages. And when the riskier mortgage market blew up, eventually Fannie got hit. And now, by the way... Mm-hmm.
And again, when they were doing that, first they were trying to make money, but secondly they were acting in pursuit of government policy to encourage broader access to home financing. Right? There's long been a concern that low-income folks couldn't qualify for mortgages, or that there were redlining practices that excluded African Americans and other low-income people from getting mortgages. So there was a definite government push to encourage riskier mortgage financing in the name of democratizing homeownership.
That's all correct. And it was embodied in something called the affordable housing targets, so that a certain portion of their business had to be aimed at either buying or securitizing mortgages from people of low to moderate income. And it's just a fact of life that a lot of those, or more of those mortgages, are going to be either subprime or Alt-A or not prime quality. And by the way, there were a number of what we would say rich people or upper income people that also borrowed to the hilt.
Absolutely.
And they got in trouble too.
Yes. So now that it's hit the fan, so what happened? They're borrowing, people investors started fearing the worst, thinking that that this debt issued by the GSEs wasn't as risk-free as they had thought in the past, and so their borrowing costs started escalating. And is that what precipitated ultimately the crisis?
Well, that's sort of the second step. The first step is that their accountants, basically internally and externally, forced them to write down or to recognize losses on their mortgage portfolio.
Yeah.
And so they had to recognize these losses. And when you write down assets, you cut into your capital. And so they had less capital, and then their bondholders got nervous, as you said, and then the spread between their borrowing costs relative to Treasury started to increase. Sorry, one of the cell phone technology problems of today. I had to turn it off. So in any event, as their capital started to fall, the regulators came in and said, you've got to issue more stock so that you have more capital to back up your losses.
Yeah.
And as they issued more stock, of course, that diluted the value of the existing shareholders, and then their stock price tanked, and it continued to fall, and it got to the point where a lot of people started worrying about whether even their debt was any good. And by the way, their debt is held all over the place. It's held by banks around the country. It's held by foreign governments and foreign banks. And Secretary Paulson started getting phone calls from everybody who was holding Fannie debt, and they were worried about whether Fannie was going to be able to make good. And at the end of the day, Treasury decided, well, I've got to go to Congress and get fallback authority to rescue them in case they get into real trouble. And only recently, Secretary Paulson finally took action after the Democratic and Republican conventions were over, so there would be less political blowback. And Treasury came in and said, all right, finally, we're going to go in and we're going to take them over. We're going to kick out the top management, which a lot of people have been demanding that they do. And we're going to guarantee their debt, but we're not going to guarantee the stock.
Right. Yeah.
And so there we are, and we've come full circle where they used to be, as I said, Fannie used to be on the books of the federal government, and now we've come full circle where Fannie and Freddie are going to be, at least temporarily, they're going to be creatures of the federal government. And the reason I say temporarily is that the big issue now is what to do with them after they come out of this halfway house. They're technically in conservatorship or receivership, and people now have to decide what to do with them after the market has been so-called stabilized.
So what should we do with them? How do we get out of this mess? And how do we avoid having a similar mess in the future?
Well, that's a really hard problem. In fact, it's so hard that Secretary Paulson has punted that issue to the next administration.
Right.
And to be fair to him, this is a complex issue, and I think there is an argument that Treasury in its waning days shouldn't decide such a momentous thing.
Yes.
And let the clean slate, let the new guys come in and figure out what to do. So here briefly are the options. Number one is the government could put more money back into them and let them operate somewhat like the way they used to, call them Fannie Freddie 2.0, but regulate them much more intensely and try to keep them from taking as much risk and regulate them in effect like a utility. Don't let them make as much profit. Pass along more of the implicit guarantee, the benefits of that to mortgage holders, and also prohibit them from lobbying, and keep them more or less as they are, but more tightly regulated. That's option one.
Yeah.
Option two is to privatize them, really. But you can't privatize them by just returning the two of them to the market because they're too humongous.
Right.
So people like Alan Greenspan, Peter Lawson, who's written a lot about this at AEI, have suggested, well, let's cut them up into pieces, like 5 or 10 pieces, and each of the pieces that is then returned to the market would not be too big to fail, in theory, and we'd get out of this situation of having an implicit guarantee. So that's option two. Option three is to nationalize them the way they used to be and just recognize the reality that they're government creatures and that they should be like government agencies. And then the fourth option is to liquidate them. Take their portfolios and their guarantees and gradually unwind them, sell the mortgages back into the market, and wait for the guarantees to expire over a 30-year period on the theory that the government shouldn't be in this business anyhow, so the argument goes. If we want to support housing for poor people, what we should do under this theory is let that be done by the government explicitly on budget, but not create a humongous organization with all its risks to go and do that. So those are your 4 options, and I want to tell you there are pros and cons to every single one of them.
Sure. What do you lean in favor of one, and if so, why?
You know, I'll be honest.
Is there one that you would say, nah, I can't push the button on that one, or?
I think, frankly, I could push the button on it. I can make a respectable argument for any one of these, and I can also make a respective opposing argument. I will tell you the least disruptive thing to do is option number 1, which would be to return them to the market but regulate them more intensely. And if I had to predict, I think that's what's going to happen, because I'm assuming that after the election the Democrats are still going to control Congress. Democrats are very unlikely to support any of the privatization options. Now, there may be some Democrats who would support actually nationalizing them, but I think, largely speaking, the Democratic constituency in Congress is in favor of keeping them in some form, and so that means regardless of who's president, even though Senator McCain has wanted to privatize them, he would have to try to persuade Congress to do something else, and I doubt that's going to happen. So I think,
and they've had a very cozy lobbying relationship with Congress over the years.
That's an understatement. They have an army of lobbyists. It's well known. They have been able to get away with, I think, having more severe government oversight by saying to Congress and the American people, look, we're here benefiting a home ownership. They've run ads on TV, warm and fuzzy ads saying about how they're helping the homeowner and so forth. And so, yes, they've been very successful lobbying to this point. Now, of course, given the mess, I don't see many politicians rushing to embrace them.
So this isn't the first time that we've had a gigantic financial mess caused by government policy of encouraging homeownership. We had the savings and loans meltdown of the 80s, an industry created by government policy to encourage mortgage lending, given regulatory advantages in that area, set up with controlled interest rates that it paid out, regulated until the late 70s, I guess, under so-called Regulation Q. You had passbook savings at, I think it was 5.5% or something like that. Right. That regulatory design fell apart during the inflation of the 70s people started pulling their deposits out of the savings and loans because they were only paying 5.5%. They could get more money in money market funds and money that would, rates that would keep up with inflation. So they started losing their shirts that way, and then they were finally deregulated on the interest rate side. But then they were caught in this mismatch of having long-term assets, these mortgages, 30-year mortgages, and then short-term liabilities at free market interest rates now, and they went insolvent. And they were insolvent for quite a while, and during that time, people pretended they weren't and even expanded their lending powers to hopefully grow them out of the mess, and that made matters even worse until basically the whole industry just was liquidated in a huge cleanup in the late 80s and early 90s. Is that a fair enough capsule history of the S&L experiment?
You did a great job. I think you're all right, except they weren't liquidated. I think at the end of the day, we liquidated a bunch of them that were insolvent. Yeah. There are still some that were left. I mean, basically...
Yeah, some, right. But
yeah.
Most, it's a shadow of its former self.
Yes, that's correct. And eventually, at some point in time, since they look like banks today, eventually their charter, I believe, will be folded into a bank charter, and the industry will look no different than banks. But yes, you've accurately summarized it. Now, the S&L crisis of the 1980s, and that's actually how I got my academic start. I spent a lot of time writing about that issue.
Yeah.
And then I was actually on a commission a congressional commission to look at the postmortem of all that, and I think you accurately summarized what our commission found. And that cost us back then, in those dollars, about $150 billion. Now today, I guess in today's dollars, that'd probably be double. We're talking maybe $300 billion, just to give round numbers. If we look at the current crisis, compare the current crisis to that, It hasn't cost the government anywhere near that much money yet, thank goodness.
Yes.
But if you look at the bloodbath in the private sector, so far to date, there have been roughly $500 billion of write-offs in the banking system, both in the U.S. and elsewhere around the world, due to the subprime mess and the collateral damage. And there are forecasts that that number could double in the next year or two. So
I'm sorry, what's that number again? Say that number again?
We're roughly $500 billion of losses so far. And that's suffered by banks.
Right.
And then the banks, in order to stay solvent, they've had to issue capital to sort of replace those losses. And to date, approximately $350 billion of new capital has been issued and raised. So that means there's sort of a net minus of about $150 billion, which has disappeared from bank balance sheets as a result of this mess so far. And as I said, there are more losses to go. I mean, I think the IMF has projected that at the end of the day we could suffer $1 trillion of losses, which would mean another $500 billion still needs to be recognized or suffered. I think there's some more optimistic analysts who could believe that it's only maybe $200 or $300 billion. But whatever the number is, we're talking real money, lots of money.
And so you've got Fannie and Freddie's losses on their own, but to what extent are they culpable for the larger losses being experienced outside? That is, to what extent did everyone's sense that this market can't really go south because the Feds are backing up Fannie and Freddie and they're holding half the mortgages, and so this whole market is one that's just too big to fail, and so we can to what extent was that moral hazard problem, do you think, influencing behavior across the board in this market?
Well, it contributed to a lot of it, although there are a lot of mortgages out there, and I don't have the numbers at my fingertips, that don't have a Fannie or Freddie guarantee. So there are what are called jumbo mortgages, and then there are really subprime mortgages. I mean, Fannie and Freddie did not securitize all subprime mortgages. There are a lot of that stuff out there. And so we have a lot of what are called private label mortgage-backed securities, or their close cousin, collateralized debt obligation, or CDOs, because what Wall Street did is they took a lot of this stuff and they transmogrified it into some very complicated securities. And to make a long story short, Fannie or Freddie, I don't know whether it's half of it, 40% of it, or whatever, but there's a good chunk of it that's out there because the private market had problems too, and it had moral hazard in a big time in the private market. And we know now what the moral hazard was. It was the fact that the mortgage originators didn't care about the quality of the mortgages because they sold them to the banks or the investment banks that were packaging these things up into securities. And then the credit rating agencies were key to this. As long as you could structure security that got a AAA rating, the institutional investors out there, pension funds or mutual funds or whatever, they would buy and snap this stuff up. So if I had to look for sort of 2 points of fault along the line here, it's we obviously had a problem at the mortgage origination end. In retrospect, I think a lot of people would say we shouldn't have let no doc loans and no interest loans and no equity loans go through this mess. That's sort of one issue. And then the second issue is there was a severe problem with the rating agencies. They just were rubber stamping securities that should have never been rubber stamped.
Yeah. Well, so with all this broader context, this explains why my blood pressure rose this morning when I read a front page article in the Washington Post that I'm getting out by Steve Pearlstein. Headline: Financial rescues show that faith in free markets is shaken. Then I'll just read a couple of passages here. As with the Great Depression, it has taken a full-blown financial crisis to shake the faith that free markets will always deliver better outcomes than politicians and bureaucrats. Also, a generation of Americans that has lived through the savings and loan crisis of the 80s, the internet bubble of the 90s, and the current credit crisis is likely to retain both a lingering suspicion of unregulated markets and a willingness to use the power and resources of the government to enhance economic stability. Well, I'll give the internet bubble to the private market. That was a straight up asset bubble that I don't think government policy had much to do with. But the idea that the S&L crisis and this current Fannie Mae, Freddie Mae, or in general market mortgage blow up, the idea that those indicate that that unregulated markets don't work well, and that we need more government involvement by politicians and bureaucrats to enhance economic stability. Well, that's just crazy talk, isn't it?
Well, taken to its extreme, I think it is. But I think I would interpret all this to say, look, every market needs rules, right?
Yes,
rules of the road. And basically, the S&Ls, we had the wrong rules.
Yes.
As you well summarized, we artificially, we regulated them too much. And we put them in a box where they couldn't make money, and then economic forces came along and blew us out of the box. So the rules were wrong in the case of S&Ls. So, and let's take this crisis. Well, it turns out some of the rules were wrong there, too. We let mortgages be originated that shouldn't have been originated. We did not oversee banks the way they should have been. So I would say there is a failure in the rules and their enforcement, but not something that would go to the wholesale rejiggering of capitalism, certainly.
No, right.
I mean, and I don't think so. For example, I don't think we're in a world where people should say, well, free markets are dead and we don't have to worry about it. I think actually what's happening now is that since shareholders have gotten creamed in all this, and there are people that have lost real money on a lot of these bonds. Not all these bonds have been guaranteed. People have lost lots of money on collateralized debt obligations and so forth. People are going to learn from this. They already are learning from this. They're going to be a lot more careful lending money, and with or without regulation. And so I think one inherent part of markets, and I'm not defending the current situation, but there's no way to get around bubbles and the fact that they burst. And I think the challenge for all policymaking is to try to reduce the frequency of bubbles and the consequences of when they burst. But it's just sheer fantasy to believe that we can have the government come in and try to prevent all bubbles, regardless, because if we'd have that, government would smother economic growth if they did that.
Yeah. Well, let's switch gears a little bit to another area where faith in free markets is shaken, and that's the area of trade policy and trade liberalization. This is a good topic for us because this is how we got to know each other. It was actually 10 years ago, back in 1998. The Business Roundtable was reacting to the failure of President Clinton's fast-track legislation to win approval in Congress. It was the first time that a president had submitted a proposal for fast-track trade negotiating authority. That's the authority to go out and negotiate trade agreements that then would be voted up or down by Congress without amendments. He had submitted something in the fall of '97. It was yanked from the floor at the last minute because it didn't have the votes. Business Roundtable decided that they needed to send someone that Republicans might listen to, and someone that was me, supposedly, and someone that Democrats might listen to, that was you, supposedly, from Cato and Brookings, to go around to various congressional districts that were where they were kind of swing districts on this fast-track vote, and preach the free trade and globalization gospel. So we did a road show and went and did several gigs, and I can't remember now various places. I think we were in Toledo and
I remember we went to Ohio.
So anyway, that's how we got to know each other. Since then, really, there hasn't been a lot of progress in public support for trade liberalization. There actually finally was a fast track or trade promotion authority bill that was passed back in 2001. It was passed really only because of the specter of 9/11, which had just occurred a few weeks beforehand, and a president with overwhelming approval ratings at that time able to push it through, and we then got some free trade agreements out of that. The Central American Free Trade Agreement was one of some significance, Australia some significance, and then a bunch with sort of very small countries with no really commercially significant relations with the United States. We started a WTO, World Trade Organization, global trade round, which has sputtered from the very beginning and now is in some sort of permanent vegetative state. The political support in Congress for these trade deals has gotten softer and softer, especially in the Democratic Party, where there's now just a handful of members of Congress that are willing to vote for trade deals as they are currently negotiated. Not much likelihood, I think, in a McCain or Obama administration for new trade promotion authority. I can't see how in the world the votes would be there. The Congress is likely to be much more Democratic next year than it is right now, and I don't see anything that's going to turn the corner on their support for trade negotiation business as usual. What? You're a Democrat? You're a free trader? What do we do? Of course, there's Republican problems as well, but the problems are concentrated in the Democratic Party. What is the possibility for reconnecting the Democratic Party with an agenda of opening markets around the world?
Well, this is a huge issue. As a Democrat, I am sorely disappointed in the way things have developed. Part of it is a failure, I think, of economists to try to develop language that politicians can use and really in sound bites and explain the virtues of free trade. This is a trick, and I think economists could probably devote a lot more of their effort instead of building fancier models of trade to try to actually simplify this and allow politicians to speak more frankly to people, and I'll have some suggestions in a minute about how to do that. But I think the core issue among Democrats and what's driving the nervousness of free trade is that median family income just hasn't been growing very well at all in the last 10 years. We have rising anxiety about the fraying of the safety net, whether it's public or private, and Democrats worry about people who get hurt. That's historically what the party's worried about. And there's a widespread popular perception, which is wrong, by the way, but nonetheless it's easy to blame foreigners. It's a perception that foreign trade is causing this.
Yes.
To a lesser extent, maybe immigration, and I think that fuels some of the. By the way, it fuels a lot of the anti-immigrant feeling in the Republican Party too.
Absolutely.
And so
there's xenophobia for everybody.
Yeah, and so there's lots of anxiety out there. And the anxiety is about falling down the ladder, and there is economic evidence to show, by the way, today, that if you lose your job involuntarily today, you are more likely to suffer a severe drop in your income when you do finally get a new job than was true, let's say, 10 or 15 years ago. And so
unemployment has changed a lot. It used a much bigger component in the old days was just temporary layoffs. There was a fall in demand, laid off a bunch of folks. They waited around for things to recover. They came right back to those old jobs. These days, when unemployment spikes in an economic downturn, it's because whole industries are shrinking, whole companies are dying. There's no layoffs and coming back. You're gone from that place for good. You've got to move to a different company, a different industry, a different state. Mm-hmm. The whole process is much more frictional than it used to be, and therefore the likelihood of if you had been doing well and with a specific sort of firm-specific human capital, and that firm's gone, then the likelihood is you're going to have to take a big pay cut if you're looking for work elsewhere.
Right, and so there's that huge anxiety, and then, of course, we layer health insurance on top of that.
Right.
So we've had a declining percentage of the population. We're down to roughly 60% that's covered by employer-provided health insurance. That's down from probably, 70% a number of years ago. And now when you lose your job, not only is it hard to get health insurance at the new job, but if you try to get health insurance on your own, you've got the pre-existing condition problem, and people get denied insurance, or they get into a small pool and their insurance rates are jacked up. And so there's lots of legitimate anxiety, and politicians respond to that by saying, well, if we tighten up on trade, that'll ease it somehow. And so I would say that Democrats are probably not going to come around to even thinking about or being open to more free trade deals until we address the anxiety. And that means having broader health care coverage, and also, I think, a revamped unemployment insurance system. And here's the utter irony, in watching the convention speeches this week. It was Senator McCain, not Senator Obama, who actually proposed... He talked about wage insurance.
Yeah.
He talked about wage insurance, which is an idea that I modestly have been writing about for 20 years with various co-authors, Bob Lawrence at Harvard, and there's a woman named Lori Klutzer at University of California, Syracuse, at Santa Cruz, and also my colleague at Brookings, Lael Brainerd. In different versions of these papers for 20 years, we've been writing about a system that would say if you lost your job involuntarily, that when you get a new job, the government would make up some portion of the wage loss. There'd be a cap to it, maybe $10,000 or $15,000, and it wouldn't last forever. Maybe it would last a couple of years. But the virtue of such a system is that not only does it protect you on the downside, but it also gives you a very strong incentive to find a new job, even if it means moving, and even if it means a pay cut, because your wage insurance doesn't kick in until you actually get that new job. And so this would reduce some of the friction in the labor market and also address some of this anxiety that people feel. Now, in all fairness, I think in his book, Audacity of Hope, Senator Obama actually, I think, made some nice noises about wage insurance, but it has not been sort of a central theme of his campaign. But actually, to my surprise, Senator McCain actually talked about it in his acceptance speech, which I think is real progress.
Well, let me say a couple of things. First, maybe this is unusual for someone coming from Cato, but I don't have a philosophical objection to rethinking the safety net, in particular something like wage insurance. That makes me a squish, I think, by Cato standards. But I accept the inevitability and appropriateness of a government safety net, and the idea of a safety net is social insurance. That is risky contingencies where people have big losses and where markets don't exist to cover those losses, that it's appropriate for government to protect people, or at least cushion people from the blows of those losses, and that can redound to the overall dynamism of the economy by preventing, by allowing a more unregulated economy that people are confident about creative destruction, that they're not going to be completely wiped out when they lose their job. So I buy into that, and I think we often do see libertarians frequently just are no on all of these things, but that's not an alternative. What we frequently see is that unless you protect individuals from losses, what ends up happening is that you start protecting industries from losses, So I think corporate welfare is a much worse problem, and rigging markets and protecting incumbents from competition in the name of protecting their employees from dislocation is a terrible way of going about doing things. It kludges up the whole system, slows down growth, makes everybody poorer over the long term. So I would much rather have the protection go directly to affected individuals than gumming up whole industries. That said, two things. First, historically, we've gotten into this situation where Democrats don't support trade agreements, not because of conditionality of supporting trade agreements conditioned on something having to do with wage insurance or helping people who lose their jobs, but rather injecting labor and environmental standards into trade agreements. So, like in the Clinton administration, the early days, I think there was a debate on how do we address anxiety about globalization? Do we address it through ramping up or reinventing our domestic safety net, or do we address it by expanding the agenda of trade negotiations to include things like labor and environmental standards, which people worry that poor countries have an unfair advantage because of their cheaper wages or laxer environmental standards? And for whatever reason, that was where Democrats ended up, that they said, okay, we'll support trade liberalization if we can have these labor and environmental rules. The problem with that is that the countries we were negotiating with didn't want those rules. They saw them as smokescreen protectionism, and the Republicans didn't like those provisions at all because they saw it as some sort of new layer of international regulation. And so for every Democrat you might have picked up from trade and environmental, or for labor and environmental standards, you lost Republicans, and you basically poisoned negotiations with many other countries. So, by my way of thinking, that whole experiment was a miserable failure. But it, I'm afraid, sort of created a path down which we've gone, where now Democrats don't think they can be good Democrats unless they insist upon what I think are poison pills, trade, labor and environmental standards in trade agreements, and that's where we've gotten. If instead Clinton had said, I'm going to appease anxiety about globalization with wage insurance, that would have been a different path. But that's not the one we've gone down. Secondly, let's say we put in wage insurance and we had a better healthcare financing system so people were less anxious about losing their jobs. Does that really solve our problems with negotiating trade agreements with other countries? It doesn't do a thing, really, with the number one grievance people have with U.S. trade policy, which is our farm subsidies. And so, yes, it might make it more possible to get trade promotion authority, but will we really get deals out of it? Because I'm afraid the things that are the hang-ups in the actual negotiations with the rest of the world don't have much of a nexus with either labor and environmental standards or safety net issues, and that is our big honking farm subsidies, which we just re-upped for another 5 years recently.
Well, I agree with everything you've said, as an economist, I'm disappointed with the whole discussion of labor and environmental standards because, the economics profession knows that that's just a code word for protection.
Yeah.
And I agree with your recounting of the history. I'm going to add an additional problem. I'm not going to necessarily say I know any solutions to this, but, trade representatives and administrations that are, quote, for free trade, they count their success by the number of agreements.
Yes.
Rather than by the output. And there is overwhelming economic theory, and I think I credit here mostly Jagdish Bhagwati of Columbia University and the Council of Foreign Relations, who has argued very persuasively and has a new book out to this effect, which argues that all these individual trade agreements, they're called preferential trade agreements, PTAs, they're actually potentially quite dangerous, and they're harmful to the overall cause of world trade because what they have done is forced us to figure out what is the origin of any particular item or service so that we can figure out which preferential trade agreement it falls under.
Preferences, right.
And it ends up becoming just an absolute nightmare administratively. And on top of that, PTAs probably end up diverting as much trade as they created. In fact, they may divert it more, so that you may end up trading with countries that are actually less efficient than you would if you had sort of a global trade deal. So this is another problem, so that even if we're, for example, able to magically transport ourselves into a world of a better safety net so that Democrats are a bit more comfortable with trade agreements, let's assume we solve the farm subsidy problem to some degree. And by the way, there is a little bit of hope there because commodity prices now have soared, and even though they've come back a little bit, in the long run, if commodity prices continue going up, it becomes harder and harder to argue that they ought to be subsidized. So let's imagine that we're in this new world where some of these underlying conditions are gone. We're then still left with the problem that the way people think about trade is to count agreements.
Yes.
And as long as we're in that mindset and we're not going back to basically multilateral deals through the WTO, we are potentially going to undermine the trading system. I think this is a huge problem. It is not well understood. I think those of us who are on the trade arena have to start talking more vigorously about this. And I tell you, one of the things that worries me, let's think just now about the next 4 years or 8 years. If we have stasis on trade, and the best outcome is that we don't go backward, all right? That's the best outcome. But there can be a lot worse outcomes, and that is if we have no sort of forward movement on any trade deals anywhere, people start wondering, what the hell do we have the WTO for? Mm-hmm. All it does is cause us headaches, and if we weaken the WTO, we weaken the commitment to sort of multilateral rules of the game. And as that starts coming unglued, and as new generations of people, new 30-somethings come to power who really don't understand sort of how we got where we are, we end up dismantling all the progress that we were able to make in the last 4 or 5 decades to basically get rid of tariffs and non-tariff barriers, and slowly but surely we start putting termites back in the woodwork. Or pick another analogy, we throw sand in the gears, and we can wake up ourselves, in 10 years from now with a much more kludged up, much more difficult trading system than the one we have now. And globalization, which has been this inexorable force, which I would argue on balance has been good, can be gummed up so that we wake up 10 years from now and a lot of the benefits from it have been dissipated. That's what I worry about.
I worry about that. I'm not in a panic about it though.
Not yet.
Here's, if we did get trade promotion authority, and the only purpose of getting it was to negotiate more of these preferential trade agreements with their crazy rules of origin, and as a recovering trade lawyer, I can tell you I used to help clients try to figure out how they could qualify for NAFTA treatment under the rules of origin, and they are god awfully complicated. So it's just a field day for lawyers, and it's terrible. But if that's all we were going to do is negotiate more of these PTAs, then I'd say, who needs it? I was willing to give the Bush administration and Bob Zoellick's idea of competitive liberalization a try, but I feel like the agreements that resulted were with such small countries, and the provisions of the agreements were so unattractive that as we pretty much always withheld the liberalization that would have helped our economy or put it on crazy 15, 18-year phase-in periods. We also rammed a bunch of intellectual property protections down poor countries' throats that I don't think is a particularly good idea. So anyway, I'm not a big fan of these preferential agreements, and so if we don't negotiate any more, I don't think that's such a terrible thing.
Right.
I feel like perhaps we've kind of, the heroic age of trade policy has come to an end, or may have come to an end. It really started 70 years ago with the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act of 1934 under FDR. We launched the GATT right after World War II, and average tariffs were 40% back then. They're now in the developed world down to 2 or 3%. They're still high in the developing countries, but those countries right now don't seem to be in any mood to lower their tariffs in the context of global trade negotiations. They just want us to get rid of their farm subsidies and them to do nothing. So there's not much mood anywhere in the world right now for negotiating things. We don't have much to put on the table in the mercantilist logic of trade negotiations, where you concede improving your economic policy in exchange for other countries conceding improving their economic policy. All we've really got left is the ag sector and anti-dumping laws for the steel industry, and some still fairly high textile and apparel tariffs that are shot through with preferences for most of our suppliers. Just China really is affected. We're pretty free. The rich world generally is pretty free. The poor countries haven't done much in liberalization. When they have liberalized in the past, they've pretty much always done it unilaterally. They did a lot of unilateral liberalization in the 80s and 90s. China's continued growth will probably continue pushing them to modernize their economies, which means making them more hospitable to foreign investment, which means making them more open. Even if the WTO becomes moribund, all the rich countries' industries are so completely internationalized that to go back to anything like across-the-board protectionism seems to me would just be obviously economically disastrous, and is no more likely than a return to 70 or 90% tax rates. So what I fear is that yes, it's possible that on the margins the termites will chew away stuff, but I think all of the rich country industries are so completely internationalized now in their global production operations that it's hard to imagine we just don't have Team America and Team Japan and things like that anymore. So it's hard to imagine building big walls that anybody would support. So I'm afraid we're just kind of stuck these days, where we're not going to go forward very much, and where probably, if there is progress around the world in poorer countries, it's probably going to be motivated by competitive pressures from China more than by anything that happens at a negotiating table in Geneva.
I agree with all that. I think that's clearly the most likely outcome, and I think the only sort of worst-case scenario I'm positing is that as memories grow more distant, and
yes,
as I said, the new 30-somethings that come to government, when you get the new flashpoints, the new Chinese arguments, whatever it is, for example, we've had the threatened retaliation against China about their exchange rates and so forth. It's been on the table. When you get these flashpoints, the worst case scenario is we sort of start building bricks of protection that over time bring us back to a world that we used to have maybe 30 years ago. And I worry about that. It's not the end of the world. I just don't want us to I'd prefer that we don't go back to it. But I think
Absolutely.
you're right. I think we may be on the road because, the problem with the WTO situation is that it's a clunky way to do trade negotiations. There are 100 and God knows how many countries that participate as part of the WTO, and it's hard to do trade deals.
Yeah, it used to be you get 4 guys in a room from U.S. and Canada and Japan, the EU, and they'd hammer something out, and that would be it. And you can't do that anymore. So.
Right, and so at any event, as I said, all this is all academic because I think the number one job of government over the next at least 4 to 8 years is to figure out what to do about the safety net, regardless. And
so
we're going to have a debate about that in this country, and hopefully we'll have a more positive than negative outcome.
Well, let's talk about the lagging growth for median income, and of course that is inspiring economic anxiety. It's inspiring bad ideas for re-regulating the economy, and inspiring a lot of sort of brain-dead economic populism. But it is a real phenomenon that although I think the claims that there has been complete wage stagnation or income stagnation for ordinary Americans over a generation, I think those claims are not based in fact, or they're based in bad readings of the numbers. There has been growth. The fact is that growth is not been evenly shared. People at the top are doing great, and generally people who are college educated have been doing better than the rest. And in particular, we've seen over the past generation a big opening of what we call the college wage premium. That is, the average person with a college degree makes about 80% more than the average person with a high school diploma. Back in 1980, that was about 40%, so it's doubled, and the graduate degree premium's gone up even more. So now we've got a situation where the premium for being highly skilled and highly educated has gone up a lot, and it's stayed high for a long time. And this is puzzling and a matter of concern. This premium has jumped up and down over time. There's a very interesting new book by a couple of Harvard economists, Claudia Golden, Lawrence Katz, called "The Race Between Education and Technology," and they trace skill premiums over the course of the past century. And they were very high at the beginning of the 20th century. They went down, down, down over the course of the 20th century until the 70s. So that in the 70s, Richard Freeman, a famous labor economist, wrote a book that got a lot of attention, The Overeducated American, saying that too many people are going to college now, and in fact the college wage premium went way down during the 70s. But then, lo and behold, it started going up again in the 80s and continued in the 90s, and it stayed high. So what's happened is this premium is really a signal from the marketplace telling workers the economy needs more highly skilled workers. So it's a kind of a glass half full, glass half empty story. The glass half full part is that the demand for highly skilled workers in the economy keeps going up, and that's a wonderful thing. It would be terrible if the demand for highly skilled workers were stagnant and we had an economy that was just reliant upon sort of brute physical labor or just mind-numbing clerical tedium. In fact, the demand for sort of analytically complex or tasks and jobs that are sort of require talent and that are challenging and interesting. Those kinds of jobs keep the demand for the people to fill those jobs keeps going up. What has happened is, and that's what the college wage premium is saying, that the demand for those jobs has raced ahead of the supply. So in a well-functioning market, if you get a signal like that, supply should respond. And so there should be an increase in supply to meet that demand. We saw that in the 60s and 70s, a huge explosion of people going to college. We haven't seen that since the 80s. Katz and Golden say that that the average annual growth of college grads relative to the rest of the workforce was 3.77% between 1960 and 1980. It's been 2% between 1980 and 2005, so almost fallen in half. Mm-hmm. And so that's a from an economic perspective, that's a puzzling failure to respond to a very clear and emphatic market signal. And I think that a big problem with the sort of growing income inequality, with lagging growth in the middle and bottom of the income distribution, is that not enough people have the skills that the marketplace needs right now and that it is willing to reward highly. And so a lot of people see this and react to it and say it's an economic policy problem, that the economy is bad because it's not creating enough high-paying jobs. But I think, in fact, this is really kind of in important ways can be seen as a capitalist success story, that the economy is doing so well and developing so continuously that it is offering more opportunities for smart, talented, highly skilled people than there are people to fill them. So what we have is not an economic policy problem, we have a social policy problem. Yeah. How do we produce the people that the economy needs, and if we could, then we'd have a lot more people doing better, and of course we would also have inequality going down because the wage premium would go down as supply rose. So I think we have a big, enormous social policy problem that we're being diverted from with a lot of economic populism, but it's a tough one, and I don't know if that's, you see things that way, and of course with Kauffman Foundation, with your focus on education, that's got to be, an obvious place to start. Is if we want to get more people going to college, then we need more people academically prepared to do college level work, which means that we need a better K through 12 educational system.
That's exactly
fit in
right.
with your worldview? Absolutely.
And the problem is what to do about it. And so if we concretize it in the so-called high school dropout problem, so what do we do to basically address that? And by the way, it's not just, as you know, it's not just an urban core problem. Kids in the suburbs, white kids in the suburbs are dropping out too. Yeah. And so we have an endemic social problem.
Yeah, so just to back up really quickly and give a couple more numbers. So we've got this sluggish growth in college graduates, but we've also have just stagnation in the high school dropout rate. It got up to 75, 80% by, there's different ways to measure it, but if you measure it just most crudely, high school graduates, this leaves out the people who get GEDs, but high school graduates as a percentage of 17-year-olds, then really the high school graduation rate peaked in the late 60s, 70s, maybe 75 or 80%. It's actually gone down a few points since then, according to Nobel Prize winner James Heckman. And it's been stuck at 70, 75% for a generation. And that means, that minority kids, it's really high percentages that are dropping out. And there's been virtually no progress in all this time on that front. So you've got two things. You've got a market stick that tells people if you drop out of high school, you're doomed. And then you've got a market carrot, which if you get a college degree, you've got a chance of going somewhere in life. And neither of those is working, which means I think we've got social policy problems.
Yeah, but I'll just take one thing at a time. If we could just figure out a way to get kids at least through high school, then we have a chance maybe to get them to go on. And so I guess, I don't have any magic bullets to this. We at the Foundation worry a lot about this. For example, we have one very well-known program here at the Foundation called the Kauffman Scholars Program, which was actually started by Mr. Kauffman when he was alive. And what our foundation is doing is in the Kansas City area is we are taking kids from disadvantaged backgrounds, and 300 of them every year, starting in the 7th grade, will receive supplemental support and help throughout their college education, and we will promise to pay their college education if other sources can't pay it, as long as they stick to the program. And what we are showing, at least in the first several years of our program, is that this is having a noticeable effect. Kids that were maybe 1 or 2 years behind grade level when they start the program have advanced in grade level, and they're doing a lot better, and we think there's going to be a much higher college attendance rate as a result of these cohorts going through. The problem is, of course, there's not a Kauffman Foundation for every kid in America.
Right.
I wish there were. And by the way, there have been similar programs to this in other parts of the country. I think very well-known Gene Lang program, for example, did it a number of years ago. But the core problem is, what are we going to do on a mass basis? How are we going to save this generation of kids? And this leads us directly, inexorably, into the mess in public education, especially in urban areas. And at least in my research and in my talking with people, we don't have a prayer to address this problem, it seems to me, as long as we're stuck with a Soviet-style education system. One size fits all, no incentives or few incentives within public schools for teachers to do a better job, no performance-based pay. Essentially, if we were judging the private or the public school system by any standards of private enterprise, it would fail. It would have gone out of business a long time ago, because it's not producing the kids, the so-called widgets, the high-quality widgets in the labor force that we need. So that's why it leads conservative places, free market places, but I'll tell you increasingly, not just conservative places, we need a lot more competition in our school system. Yeah. Now, as it turns out, politically, when voucher proposals go to the ballot in various states, they don't seem to do very well. No, they don't. And the reason is that teachers' unions and other people who are wedded to the old-style system have successfully, it seems, argued that if a kid has a voucher or their parents have a voucher, that this will starve the kids that are left behind, and we'll be left with a lot of rotten schools. And the kids somehow in those schools will be punished even further. And so the alternative to vouchers, which has now become increasingly looked to, is the charter school movement. Yeah. Which are public schools. A lot of people don't understand that. And they have just a lot greater freedom. And that's why they're called charters. They operate under a charter. The unfortunate fact is that there are only a handful of states or cities, so Washington, D.C. is one where there's actually a liberal charter rule, which has a lot of freedom and allows these charter schools to form. Actually, in Missouri here, we have a pretty liberal charter law. And we see a growing movement around the country. I think there are roughly 3,000 charter schools now, where we're having more and more charters over time. Now, the critics of charters say, well, there are a lot of bad charters out there. They go out of business, and therefore, let's dump charter schools. Well, that's just like saying...
What a fantastic idea that a bad school would go out of business.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's like saying, well, we shouldn't allow competition in any other sector of the economy because some firms fail. Well, that's not the standard we use in the rest of the economy. And the fact is I think careful studies of charter schools, such as those that have been done by Carolyn Hawksby, who's now at Stanford University, show that on balance, charter schools do advance education. And I think ultimately, if there's any magic solution, I think it's going to have to be a spreading of the charter movement. And there are going to have to be lots of different kinds of charter schools, because ultimately what it's going to require to address that college dropout problem is not so much the quality of the school. That's important. You've got to keep the kid interested enough in going to school every day so that they show up. Yeah. And this is a huge problem, because if all you're going to do is drill kids in math, then they ski, as an example, and drill them in memorization of rote facts and so forth, well, no wonder a lot of kids from inner cities don't go to school. They don't see any connection of that to the rest of their lives, especially if they're in a high gang area or whatever, they think that they may be shot by the time they're 20. And so, understandably, kids in inner cities have much shorter time horizons than kids, let's say, in the suburbs. That leads them to be less interested in school. They don't show up, and it's a vicious cycle. So, this is a hard nut to crack, but I think we're going to have to develop more charter schools that are going to be formed around much more innovative curricula to attract these kids so that they'll show up in school.
Well, I'm for more competition in the educational system by any means necessary. I'm completely in the tank for vouchers and tax credits and private school choice, but absolutely, I don't want what I consider the better to be the enemy of the good. More liberal charter school laws would be a great improvement. a wider adoption of what's called per-student funding for public schools, for regular public schools, would be a big plus, where you have, instead of everyone just being assigned to a school, you have relatively open enrollment, and schools get more money based on how many students they attract, and less money if they lose students. There are a number of states that have this kind of arrangement, and that are injecting some competition that way. Let me back up and say that I think you and I both recognize that anything we do in the educational system isn't going to be a panacea. There's been study after study that shows that when you're looking at educational outputs, educational attainment, differences between schools, whatever kind of schools they are, and differences in different inputs of student-teacher ratios, teacher qualifications, whatever you can think of, just money per student, whatever you can think of, that differences within schools are much more important than differences between schools, and the differences within schools is the students. And the number one factor in determining educational attainment is the socioeconomic status of the kids' parents. People from middle class and upper middle class backgrounds do well in school. People from less advantaged backgrounds don't, and that seems to me to be deeply connected to family and community environments that both set the time horizons for the kids, set the expectations for the kids, and it's very difficult for schools, however good, to compensate more than partially for deficits in those family and community environments. But nonetheless, they could do a lot better job than they're doing now, and competition is the only way that I can think of that has any prayer of success. It's heartening that Obama is at least interested in the charter school side of public school choice. I wish he'd go further, but that's he has hinted at a willingness to take on the core Democratic constituency of teachers' unions and support a greater degree of choice. And McCain made some noise out of nowhere in his acceptance speech about supporting vouchers. I don't know. I just don't think that's really a serious thing that he's really has a priority about, and it's not something that federal voucher programs aren't something that's just in the cards at all anyway, or really should be. It should be at the state level, local level. But maybe we're starting to see some daylight if the Democratic candidate is starting to talk about shakeups and the way public school system works. That's what we need. That's what we need to work on. That's where we need to be directing a lot of our attention, I think.
Yeah, and there are other couple of rays of hope. I think I've seen a statistic that says something like 50% of the teachers nationwide are going to be retiring in the next, 6, 7, or 8 years.
Yes.
There's going to be huge turnover in the teacher population. And if we can somehow take advantage of this window to get superstar kids who are coming out of college to go to teachers and become teachers. Teach for America, for example, has been a phenomenal program.
Yes.
But their main difficulty has been, as you know, it's a 2-year program. One of their main difficulties is that the Teach for America kids who show up at these schools often are ostracized, or they have a hard time cracking the existing culture at the school because the teachers who are there on a permanent basis have some resentment in some places, and they make it difficult for these kids to stay. But, if I could wave a magic wand, and, I realize I can't, I'd have Teach for America 10 times its size, or even larger. They have, it's amazing, just some statistics. I think they're one of the largest employers of Ivy League schools and comparable schools in the United States. First employer. And it just shows that there's a remarkable number of kids that are willing, to do stuff like this. And maybe Obama's call, for example, of having tuition assistance conditional on public service, count Teach for America or equivalent programs as part of that, would also accelerate the number of kids doing this. And McCain himself has called for more public service. So it's conceivable that we could generate a movement to get a new generation of kids coming in to teach.
But
that would help to some degree.
Right. So I think you're right. We've got the people who are willing to who've got the talent to get the job done. We just need an institutional environment where they have a place.
That's right.
This is a gigantic topic. We could talk all day. We've already been yakking for over an hour, so I think we probably ought to wind it up. But it's been great talking to you. I hope we can get together again in this forum and in real life as well.
Okay, thanks a lot, Brent.
All right. Bye-bye.
Sure, bye-bye.